we are all lucky to have and know Miss Cibennie, who is our in North America. She is our TTC DEI director, and performance and development director in our PNC team. If you haven't had the chance to work with her before or had a lesson or any kind of training with her before, she is absolutely brilliant. We're so lucky to have her. And very lucky to have her lead us in this next conversation about how to cultivate inclusive behavior, which I think is a really great transition from the last session, because now we've seen how what it looks like when you have an inclusive situation and when you don't have an inclusive situation. If, as Jessica was saying, she's teaching her children to have this inclusive mindset so that when the conversation comes up, it's not going to be an affront to and a difference to them. It'll be something to celebrate. And so, Jessica, you're doing an amazing job at that. Everyone at TTC that I know is doing an amazing job with it. So Cibennie's here to help us learn how to cultivate inclusive behavior in our lives and our work. And I will hand it over to you. That is right, Ian. Cibennie is our superstar.
Thank you, Ari, for that wonderful introduction. And truthfully, I don't know how on earth to follow Jose, Jessica, and Sarah. I mean, goodness, thank you so much for just the education, the impact, and just the power of sharing your stories. Honestly, I was sitting here like, oh, get it together before you have to start speaking. So, really, thank you for everyone. I echo what Jose said, everyone putting things together. Um, and as Ari said, it's a perfect segue to talking about looking at ourselves first. That really is the crux of cultivating inclusive behaviors. So we're going to go through brief highlights on how we can look at the value of inclusivity, and really focusing on challenging our own mindset, because as you heard from their three stories, that is such a big piece of it. Um, so I think it's important to take a little step back and first talk about really what is diversity and inclusion, and do we really know the difference between the two? So when we talk about diversity, think about the team around you, think about the people in your personal life. Um, Diversity is looking around and being able to see that there are different people all throughout our walks of life. Diversity is everything that makes every single one of us unique. So, what's our national origin? What languages do we speak? What's our race? What's our color? Are we someone who has a disability? Our ethnicity, our gender, our age, religion, sexual orientation. You know, the list goes on and on. Socioeconomic status, even our family structure. How diverse is the circle around you? I want you to think about, though, inclusion for a second. Inclusion is not just having those people around you, but having people around you and really genuinely giving them the sense that they add value and that their voice can absolutely be heard. And really knowing that they have a genuine sense of belonging when they're in your presence. That's what makes people feel included. So, the perfect small analogy is always think about it as you're invited to a party. So you might look different, or you might not be the norm of what you expect to be at the party. So you see that the party is diverse. Being asked to dance at the party, that's inclusion. And real diversity is recognizing that the people around you aren't just a set of attributes on a spreadsheet, but that every voice is really unique. So it's not just about us being around one another and having people from all different walks of life, but genuinely encouraging those team members that are around you and the people that are in your lives that aren't exactly like you, encouraging them to speak up and have their unique perspective. That's the approach we want to take. That's the approach that makes diversity lead to greater inclusive practices every single time. So we really have to be conscientious of how is it that we show up, showing that we value inclusivity. And there have been multiple studies, especially over the last 2 years, um, But in recently, 2022, all the different statistics show us that driving inclusivity has a huge positive impact, and really highlights some things that we can expect to get out of it. So one, for us personally and professionally, we have that increased sense of learning and we have an increased sense of connection with people around us. So I really want you to take time to consider, when was the last time you really took the time to learn from people around you who were different, about their perspective, about what certain things mean to them in their life? When was the last time you really solicited their perspective and were really intentional about learning something new, or maybe cultivating a genuine connection or getting a different perspective? Everything that we know about diversity and inclusion studies, it really shows us that what happens when we do that, when we have these conversations, when we're really intentional about it, these conversations, they make people show up as their most productive, their best selves. Um, and I'm actually stealing a quote that Liz McGivern just put in the chat during the last session. She said, "We have to learn from each other or we will never progress." And I thought, I have to steal that for the next session because it's so impactful. So we absolutely have to put it into play, and we have to understand that when we do the work about being intentional, when we do the work about being inclusive, it increases people's sense of belonging. And it's not just the importance, which we're going to get to the business impact of it in just a second. But at a fundamental level of us as humans, we have such a great human impact on one another when we reach across and we're intentional about connecting and being inclusive and getting someone's perspective, or asking them the question and saying, you know, I think my daughter, might be feeling a certain way, and reaching out to Jose or Frankie or anyone in your circle at work or personal to really get that sense of belonging and connection. Big picture wise, when we think about how it impacts us as a business, we really set our teams and our business up for longevity, and we absolutely impact our bottom line when we think about each other as human and we value each other's experiences and differences. So, a few things I want to share with you, as far as if you think about it from business perspective, and how just treating people with simple human kindness and being inclusive will impact your day to day. Seeking out candidates that have cognitive diversity, meaning diversity of thought, their values, their personalities. It's essential to who we are as a business. It's what helps us thrive. It's what helps us innovate in our workplace. So we really should make sure that we're seeking out candidates with a variety of different educations. Maybe they have a completely different industry background or experience. So when it makes sense, we should absolutely be getting these people on our teams through the door, because we know that this enhances our team innovation by up to 20%. When your team members feel like their voice can be heard and they're just not there to check a box, it absolutely is going to reduce your turnover as a team. So actually, I'll take a step back because I do want to make sure, looking at it from big picture workforce management, getting people in the door, 3 out of 4 candidates actually say they go out and look for companies that have a diverse workforce, because they want to be somewhere where they feel like diversity is very important. And 32% of those applicants, they say they won't even apply if, based on what they're seeing, brand LinkedIn profiles, websites, marketing initiatives, we are being judged by what people see of us before they even talk to us. So we have to make sure that the perception of us and who we really are, not just the perception, is that we do value inclusivity and that it shows up in our marketing efforts and our people efforts. Because when we do that, and we show those team members, no, you can be accepted, you're valued, you're included, they show up happier, they're more engaged, they're more comfortable in their workplace. And that sense of belonging, it always is going to have more motivated, happier, productive team members that are with us for a longer amount of time. So when we think about just our overall workplace, we have to make sure that what are the different ages? What are the different cultures, backgrounds? Who are we bringing together? We absolutely know that statistics show us diverse organizations are considered 87% better at decision making. We get through processes quicker, faster, just from the result of having a more diverse and inclusive team. Um, we also have to consider that 70% of the teams, we're more likely to capture new markets just because we have more diversity. I actually had our group's VP, Julius, share a really great story with me last week about how he went to a conference, and it was for specifically Black travelers in the US, and covered part of the religious market. And he was saying how what a huge untapped market it is, particularly in the southern states of North America. And we had a whole conversation about tapping into new markets and how we can capture and capitalize in on that business just because those travelers feel included in what we do as a business. So it really does impact making us 35% more competitive, and we can increase our overall revenue up to 20%. So bottom line is we need to approach it from the human standpoint and making sure that different perspectives, we know it's beneficial to create that inclusive atmosphere with our teams. But at the end of the day, it also has a great, powerful impact on how we plan and we execute our business strategies. Diversity impacts every single piece of our business, from revenue to retention. We owe it to our team members and we owe it to the markets that we serve to make sure that everyone absolutely feels included. So a few practices that we can talk about as far as actioning our way to being more inclusive. The first big thing that Ari highlighted, it's all about looking at ourselves first. How do we recognize our own bias? So before we move into the other three, I do want to have you do a quick activity, and you don't have to share your answers out loud. If you would like to add some comments in the chat, please feel free to. But I really want us to do have some quick insights on how we can recognize our own bias first. So we're going to do an activity called Counter Stereotypic Images. So here's the plan. I'm going to give you a profession, and I want you to vividly take a moment to imagine what this person looks like. I want you to focus on the first image that comes to your mind. Don't overthink it. Really go with your gut, because here's where the work gets done. We have to be honest with ourselves. This is the only way we can move into being more intentionally inclusive, is if we're really thinking through the image that we see and then how do we counteract that. So if you have a pen and post-it handy, maybe you want to jot notes down, that's fine too. But really the main goal is be honest with yourselves. I'm going to give you a profession and I want you to think of what is the first image that comes to your mind, so that we can then recognize where our brain is challenging us subconsciously and how do we get through it. Can I have a thumbs up electronically so I know you're still with me? Thank you. So the first image I want you to think of, if I said to you, picture a model, what does a model look like to you? So for some, I know my first visceral reaction would be Kate Moss, Tyra Banks, someone tall, someone thin. You wouldn't necessarily first imagine someone like Winnie Harlow. And she is a very successful model in the industry, but she's someone who has a skin condition called vitiligo. Now, historically, this is not what we were trained to think of as a model. Your second one is a construction worker. What image is conjured up when you think of a construction worker? Is this the image you have in your mind? Probably not for most of us, right? I know for me, when I hear construction worker, I usually think of a man wearing a hard hat, maybe has a clipboard. He's probably using a power tool and doing something extremely stereotypically masculine. It's not most often an image of a trans woman. So this is Samantha Bowler, who is a transgender construction worker. Okay, I've got two more for you. When you think of a yoga instructor, what ideas pop into your mind? I'm sitting in Los Angeles, as many of you know. So, possibly vibes of a woman, LA vibes, Lululemon leggings that, are $150, very bendy, possibly super thin, white woman. This is Jessica Stanley. So Jessica is actually a yoga author, instructor, and an advocate. Um, Her main aim is to make everyone, regardless of gender, size, socioeconomics, she wants everyone to be on the mission with her to understand the power and impact that yoga has on everyone, mentally, physically, spiritually. So regardless of gender, size, or socioeconomics, everyone should have equal access to positive mental, physical, and spiritual health because of yoga, or being in tap with yoga. Last one, a surgeon. What does a surgeon look like in your mind? So let me introduce you to Dr. Farah Roslin. Um, Dr. Roslin is actually an award-winning surgeon who is also Muslim. She introduced a disposable surgical hijab in 2021. She actually had multiple experiences. There's some phenomenal detailed articles about her online. She was constantly challenged and being asked to wear a proper surgery hood. And her big why was that she felt so horribly uncomfortable in the ER setting or in the surgery room because she didn't have on a proper hijab. So she knew if she was having this struggle, she wasn't alone in this. So she decided to do something about it, and she ended up helping create the first disposable surgical hijab. Um, so it gives us, this activity really gives us the point to challenge what is it that we see implicitly um, in our stereotyping. We all have implicit stereotypes in our mind. There are things that we think about. So the big challenge to everyone is if you're someone who is hiring in new team members or promoting someone from a different department, we have to get better at kicking out our stereotypical ideas of what we have in our head about what is a surgeon, what is a yoga instructor, what does my next assistant look like. And that's the real point of the activity, is that we really have to make sure that we're intentional and finding counter stereotypic images for us. Stereotypes are simply an image in our brain that maybe we've seen, or an idea that we have preset about people in our mind. One big way to push back these stereotypes is to spend time really thinking about or imagining people who don't conform to these stereotypes. Whether you decide to do it visually or you Google, counterintuitive yoga instructor, we absolutely have to make sure that we are providing our brain with an alternative to the stereotypes that we may have received over the years. Counter stereotypic imaging, it's not a magic formula, right? We still have to do the work, but it is super, super powerful. And it's one of the main reasons why diversity and appropriate representation in real life, in our offices, in our arts, in our entertainment, why it's so important. Because a small exercise like this gives us the opportunity to really counter program our brains and use our imagination to retrain what might be our own unconscious bias. I want to open up the floor just for a quick second and see if there are any comments or thoughts so far, or any aha moments that you might have had while doing that exercise. You can raise your hand electronically. And So once we get to that point where we recognize, oh, I do have stereotypic images in my mind, I do have to recognize my own bias. This is what's going to make us more apt to just be open minded in general. And then to really decide that we're going to be conscientious about the language we use or to be active allies. And I love when the term active is applied to allyship versus just being performative. Um, we really have to make sure that we are all in it together to really amplify any of those underrepresented voices that are around us. Some of you might be familiar with the iceberg metaphor. The iceberg metaphor is really just a metaphor for who we are and who other people are. So when you think about an iceberg, how much of an iceberg is shown above the water? 5, 10, maybe 25%. Um, when we only look at the exterior of people, or we look at visible characteristics, oh, someone's age, they're a baby boomer, or their gender identity, race, their physical appearance, or even if they have a physical disability, we miss out on all the precious good stuff that's below the water. So we might be missing out on as much as 90%, all of the things that are below the water. But we have to first do our own job in recognizing what are my individual triggers, because that's when the true shift happens. When we take the time to really understand the biases that we have and then separate that. So, okay, what am I feeling or experiencing right now? Why am I adding all of these labels to this person or to what I'm seeing, and really challenge our why. Why am I seeing it that way? Is it because I had a bad experience when I was younger? Is it because of some preconceived stereotype that I have? But really challenging why we feel or why we're reacting the way we do in the moment. Um, that's how we challenge our minds from switching from autopilot, unconscious bias to really start challenging our own rationale, and making better decisions and taking more informed action around the decisions that we're going to make. Um, so we have to get better at getting curious and asking better questions and making sure that we're doing the work to ensure that people feel included. So I did want to provide you with a few conversation starters, a few things that you might add these to your one-on-ones, or you might discuss a few of these questions just to get to know your team a little bit better and to break down those walls of unconscious bias or stereotyping. Um, so when we are very intentional about starting the conversation, and I love that Jessica highlighted some really specific things in the last session that she had done to make it intentional with her son, to teach him age appropriately. We have to get intentional with our teams now. We have no control over what walk of life someone came to our team with, but how do we make the conversation around diversity and inclusion, how do we get that started? How do we learn about one another? How do we learn about our own unique experiences and all the wonderful stories that we come with? So it's no surprise to anyone who knows me, Cibennie, that asking a question like, well, what does your name mean? Is there a story behind your name? Versus that look of, oh, that's a really interesting name. You're essentially asking me the same thing, but it starts a different style of conversation. And for those who have chosen to ask me, what does your name mean? Is there a story behind it? They know I was named after my grandmother. Um, so little things like that, that really open up the conversation, asking about memorable lessons they've learned as children. Who taught them these lessons? You'll learn more about who they are, their family dynamic. What are some of their favorite holiday traditions or stories? And maybe you want an even bigger, broader learning about the passion of your team members. If you could start a charity, who would it benefit? What would it be for? You'll learn so much about people by asking them small but really big questions, to learn about your team and learn about how diverse they are and what is they're passionate about. Um, it might be asking about events that have impacted them over their life, because the goal is that we're connecting. The goal is that we're being curious. So we really want to make sure that like this list isn't all inclusive. I'm sure there are some wonderful questions that maybe you've asked your team members in the past. But it really is just thinking through how can I reword it, or how can I make sure that I'm leading with curiosity and not judgment, and that I really do have a vested interest in my team holistically and who they are as people and what motivates them. Another big piece of being inclusive is the language that we use. So, inclusive language plays a huge part in the perception of who we are and who we show up as it relates to inclusivity. So, one of the most common things is gendered language. So, we really need to be able to challenge ourselves. And I know there are certain terms that maybe we've used forever and it might be a hard habit to break, but we really need to make sure that we focus in on what does gender versus gender neutral language look like. So a very common one, saying husband and wife. Oh, is your husband here, at a work event? There's actually a colleague of ours that I've been with him at multiple events, and it always makes him laugh when people say, "Oh, is your wife somewhere nearby?" And he always makes a joke out of it and goes, "Oh goodness, I hope if she is, don't tell my husband." And that's his way of letting people know I don't have a wife, I have a husband, because they see a ring on his finger and they automatically assume that he's married to a woman. So simple things like that, we can show up and show people, oh no, is your spouse here? Instead of assuming that everyone's son or daughter uses he, she pronouns, asking, oh, are your children here? What are your children's names? How are your children? And getting more information. Again, understandably, some of these language terms might be hard to break, but we owe it to one another to be very conscientious, particularly when we have new team members, we're in new circles, we're at work events. We really have to make sure that we are being very intentional and not assuming, because that is what can then alienate the people around us, our team members, or just people that we're trying to connect with. So using terms like spouse, child, parent can be really important and open up to just a better rapport and better connection with the people around us. And if you don't know, it's okay to ask. That in itself makes people feel included by you saying, "Oh, do you have a pronoun preference?" That instantly shows people that you're operating on a higher plane of inclusivity than just assuming, because you're willing to have that curiosity and courage to ask the question. So actioning our way through it. We can't just simply expect inclusive behaviors to just happen. We have to really make sure that we are very intentional and that we are cultivating what it is that we want to see. So, my ultimate challenge to you um, is to get out of your own comfort zone. Um, it can look like maybe joining a TTC idea group as an ally, or maybe there's an external group, a book club, a volunteering opportunity that you can join and participate in, where the people who are part of that group don't necessarily look like you, or they're from a completely different walk of life than you are. Also, if you are seeking information, broaden your scope. Make your information source bigger and broader than just your immediate circle. I actually had someone reach out to me yesterday because they wanted a different perspective from the BIPOC community. When I say BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Um, and I thought it was really a very curious and amazing moment that she said, I mean, obviously we have to be cautious that not every experience represents that whole group of people. So we have to also be mindful that we're not generalizing. But I thought it was wonderful that the person literally called me and said, you can look at me and see I am an, this age white woman. I want your perspective on X. And I thought that that takes huge leadership courage to do that. But again, how often are we really making sure that we take the time to get intentional about our connections, and about how we reach across the aisle to really get someone's perspective, and broaden our own scope of information, and make sure that we're getting someone's unique perspective that we don't have in our own bag. So really our behaviors, whether intentional or we communicate something implicitly with the wrong message, we really have to recognize the huge impact and effect that our behaviors have on people's emotions, their mental, their physical health. Um, it all impacts us in different ways. Um, we know logically we're much more than skin color, accents, religion, body shape, gender, but we have to make sure that our behaviors show up, that show that logically, if we know this, how are my behaviors reflecting that I know that? How is it that I can make sure that I'm including everyone on my team, that people aren't being shut down, that I'm not impacting someone's self-confidence, and that they really feel like they can show up, share their creativity and their ideas. But the only way we're going to get there is if we're really intentional and purposeful in our inclusive actions and efforts. So I just realized that was a lot faster than I thought it was going to be. But I would like to open up the forum to any additional questions or insights, or just stories that people want to share about maybe aha moments that you had if you're open to being a bit vulnerable. Well, then I will say thank you for your time, and really reflect on the challenge of how do your behaviors, how is it that your inclusive behaviors absolutely align with what it is that you want people to see in you, on your team, and how you navigate the world being inclusive. Um, I look forward to absolutely hearing your thoughts about intentional behavior stories. I would love to hear those, whether it's professional or personal. Please don't hesitate to share stories of how you've challenged yourself to cultivate inclusivity. I will hand it over to Ari, I guess, to wrap us up.
Thanks, Cibennie. As per usual, and everyone on chat agrees with me, it's always impactful and wonderful to have a session with you.
Thank
Um,
you.
if you haven't had the chance, Cibennie also leads the Seven Effective Habits, or Seven Habits of Highly Effective People sessions, where a lot of this is brought up. And I recently did that with her. And one of the things that um, I really love that you stress is curiosity over judgment. And we all have that in our heads. Never assume, don't judge. But we're all gonna look at the world with our own lens. This is our upbringing. This is our culture. This is how we see the world. And it is so important to remember to remove that lens and to think about the fact that you can't assume something on someone else just from that 10% of the iceberg you see. So I try so hard to implement curiosity in my own life. I'm always very curious, but I also love talking. So sometimes that's very hard for me personally because I get so excited and I want to share and I want to talk to someone. So sometimes that is hard for me to remember to be curious um, and ask those really wonderful questions. Thank you so much, Cibennie, for sharing those icebreakers. That's also a really hard thing when you're in a group, especially in a work setting, to know how to broach a difficult subject or maybe seem a bit more inclusive. I really like the where does your name or come from or what charity you would do. I think that almost everyone I know would have a different answer. So thank you so much. Anytime you get to do a session or a panel with Cibennie, take her up on it. You can always find the training calendars on from the DEI on Yammer. I know that they're shared once a month. So please take up Miss Cibennie on a session.